WLS,
hosted by IDM.
And we are live. I'm starting everything else, but yeah, we are live. And I'm sorry, everybody, for a quick delay. Technical issues, as usual. You know, since Nina decided to call me the tech genius, everything got broken here.
Everything is working.
Right.
Intend on everything to work. Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina Show. I believe it's number 30, which is actually kind of hard for me to imagine because I wasn't really expecting to do these as consistently considering my insane work / outside life load, but it's actually a very nice little break, including the episodes where I have to prepare a lot, like today's episode. And true to my usual description, a show where we talk about death, destruction, etc., with a little bit of humor, we will talk about death or a death delayed today. So yeah. Marcelo, once again, this is our history story time that we like to intersperse with our guests. So Marcelo doesn't really know what I'm going to talk about. So much like you guys, he's basically tuning in and trying to figure out what's going on. Obviously, when I talk about these stories, sometimes there's a lot of clues, depending on how much context I can provide without really giving everything away. So his reaction is what it is. So Marcelo, there is this young man, he's 22 years old. I think we can all imagine ourselves at that age. And he is going on a vacation of a lifetime. So imagine your vacation as a young man, hopefully traveling without parents, maybe causing a little bit of trouble. And in fact, this young man is from a privileged family, so they can afford to send him on quite a lavish vacation. So this is not really like a solo trip at budget hotels, maybe like you and I, well, I don't know, Marcelo, maybe you stay at luxury hotels, but I prefer budget hotels that are still clean
at
and
22,
accessible.
At 22?
At 22.
I would love to stay in budget hotels.
I'm a little bit older than 22. I know it's difficult to tell. Compliment me, just kidding. But I still prefer budget hotels as long as they're clean and a very good accessible location in terms of public transportation, if it's in especially a large city abroad, because that leaves you more money to go to do the things that you want to do. Visit one more city, visit one more landmark, go out for one more dinner. I think it's, for me, at least it's worked. Maybe not, it doesn't work in some places, but definitely in other places it does. But basically, this young man is not like you and I, especially at the age of 22, staying at budget hotels. And he's also not traveling alone. I don't know about you, Marcelo. I prefer solo trips, but I have also traveled both with friends and without friends, but also with friends where the trip was really nice and with friends where a trip was a nightmare. And in fact, we're no longer friends. So I sort of had this full spectrum, and I prefer the kind of travel where you have a friend where you can do things together, but the friend is okay about separating from you, doing their own thing, especially if you don't share every single interest. You also have a nice break from each other where you can then get together and discuss what you've done. So in fact, my very first trip to Japan was like that. The friend who introduced me to that country, who's not Japanese, but who's been there many times, was awesome. So if I ever were to consider a person to travel with, a travel buddy, this would be the person, because we did things together. We did this thing separately. It was not an issue. A trip, actually, my only time I went to Italy, I went to Rome, was a nightmare because this particular person wanted to mold everything to her wishes, and the wishes changed on a minute-by-minute basis. And when wishes weren't, and there were multiple people involved, and when those wishes were not being catered to like a princess that she was, there were fits being thrown. So imagine 20-something-year-old, almost 30-year-old going on a 2-year-old going on 30, or the other way rather. So like toddler level tantrums. So this was like my other experience. But going back to this young man, I don't think he was a nightmare to travel with, but if he wanted to snap his fingers and get what he wanted, much like the princess who kind of a little bit dampened my trip to the beautiful city of Rome that I'd love to revisit one day again without her. If he had just snapped his fingers.
And I meet you there. It's just around the corner.
Yeah, that would be awesome, actually. And yeah, so unlike this princess, this particular young man could have just snapped his fingers. Again, I don't think he was super demanding. I mean, beyond being raised in a sort of privileged social status where he probably had that demand built into the way he was raised, he could have just asked. And no questions asked, he would have received what he wanted. So I don't think he really needed to throw temper tantrums and pretend to be a toddler like this this girl I'm thinking of, who was nearly 30 years old at the time. So yeah, he was traveling with multiple people. And in fact, it was a family tradition of his for many generations to go on this sort of, I guess you could call it coming of age. I mean, yes, he was 22. He wasn't like 18, but he was, quite young, coming of age trip where he got to learn about foreign places, foreign people, foreign wildlife, foreign landmarks. And of course, his family didn't always go to the same location. And this particular trip had multiple locations, but they sort of maintain that educational component of learning on site, which is, of course, there's no argument that it's better than just reading a book or accessing information in some other remote way where you're actually immersed in that culture, even as a tourist. So he was starting his journey in late October, and some people would say, well, that's kind of late in the year. It's going to get cold. But he was going south and he was going east. So this was probably the perfect time to go where the air was not as hellishly humid in some of these places. And he was someone who spent all of his life in a very cold place with cold winters, lots of snow. Most of the time he spent his life in a place that was also damp. And so very, very different kind of climate. So I know for someone like me, I've lived in different cities in 3 countries, but always in the north. So I handle the cold very well. I can handle heat. Let's say 40 degrees Celsius is unpleasant. I can manage it. I do not handle humidity well because I'm just not used to it. So for instance, if you talk to, an American from Louisiana versus me, like I could not do that. I could not live there. I mean, maybe eventually people can get used to anything, but I know that handling dry heat is much easier for me than handling humidity. So in fact, this summer when I was on my brief trip to Japan, I felt like I was just being slowly cooked inside my own skin because the temperature was the same compared to where, I was traveling from, but the heat was humid, right? It was maybe like 50% humidity. So it was very difficult to handle even with hydration. And I mean, I knew what I was getting into was kind of like, that's the time I had to travel, but definitely not beneficial. So I can totally understand why this privileged young man would not travel, at the height of summer, and he'd go in late October. So his first stop was to go to Greece. And in fact, he picked up a family member outside of Athens. We can call him Cousin George. Cousin George was a fun person to travel with as well. I don't know if you've ever traveled with, cousins, brothers, siblings. If you had kind of a positive experience, it was for this young man as well. And from there, they ended up going on this insane vacation of a lifetime. Can you guess what the total distance is for this trip? Now imagine multiple countries.
Yeah.
Hard to say, right? 51,000 kilometers. That is a lot.
That is a lot.
That is a lot. And he used different modes of transportation. So he would travel by railway. He would travel by water. He would use other modes of transportation. Personally, if I didn't have to go to countries where you can only get there by plane or, take a long time by boat, I would only travel by train. That absolutely, if it's like a nice train, right? Even if it's not business class, I think it's my absolutely favorite way to travel because You get to see beautiful, hopefully, occasionally beautiful landscapes, unless you're always going through cities. You get to just relax by reading or just having that mental break. I don't know, what's your favorite way of traveling? I feel like airplanes are, unless you're traveling business class, it's like a nightmare.
Well, I've never been to business class in airplane, but yeah, I like trains. When I travel around here in Europe, whenever I have the chance to go to a closed country, I prefer trains.
Yeah,
Airplane is what I call a necessary evil, or whatever you may want to call it. It's just a nightmare. And when I have to go
I feel
home,
like
it's at
between
least
the
14 hours.
security, just the security feature of it, just the crowds at airports, and yes, from what I heard, economy versus business class is not as bad in the EU. In North America, it's definitely, there's like a big gap. And so yeah, if you're like an ordinary person traveling economy and you're taller than maybe 5'9", your legs are just not gonna fit. Yeah, I mean, we've all been there. We know what that's like. So yeah, I think the fact that this young man had the chance to travel by train, I would have really enjoyed going to a lot of these places. But of course, he was not just traveling by train. He was traveling by very luxurious train. So I'm sure that was very, very, very enjoyable beyond what we've experienced. I think the only time I've taken business class train is in Japan again. Not recently though, because it was very accessible to foreigners. Foreigners got to travel by business class very cheaply, the green cars. And it was very, very nice because it was pretty much empty. So it was like, there might be a couple of people there, but it's pretty much my train car. And you feel like, the queen of the world, basically. Yeah. So anyway, he picks up Cousin George, who was super fun to travel with in Greece outside of Athens. And then he heads to Egypt. So you can kind of see why he started the journey sort of in late autumn, because where he was going, I think the weather probably would have been optimal in terms of not having to deal with, summer heat and humidity. And so he goes to Egypt. He is traveling along the Nile, obviously very impressive sights, sounds, landmarks, food, architecture, etc. And from there, he actually goes far. He goes to India. And he's kind of a typical tourist in this sense. It's kind of funny because, again, he's a very privileged young man, but he goes on a shopping spree. I'm not a big shopper, but I think sometimes it is fun to go shopping and maybe, get a couple of souvenirs for yourself, maybe like one nice thing and then some kind of less expensive things that are memorable. Also maybe getting like little gifts for, your family or your friends. That would be useful to them, or some kind of like teas, things that they would actually use, right? You go to Asia, you get them some tea because it's really good tea. And so, yeah, this young man had much better financial capability than you and I for now. I don't know if we'll ever reach that level, but yeah, he went on a shopping spree. So think of us buying souvenirs versus a privileged 22-year-old going on a shopping spree. He went on such a shopping spree that eventually some of the things he purchased in India ended up in museums. I've never been on that kind of a shopping spree. Yeah. Perhaps someday. Perhaps someday I will buy something that can end up in a museum, or maybe a private collection.
We never know what's going to happen in museums from some years from now. Perhaps they're going to put my nice,
Right, it's true. He used this thing. There we go. And in a way, he was, in addition to a shopping spree, he was also kind of a typical tourist because he really wanted to see the Taj Mahal. I've never been to India, and my background in art history is more about either Byzantine or Western art. But I've kind of here and there learned a little bit about East Asian and South Asian architecture and art, nowhere near to the extent that a professional would. And so I actually had to teach a little class on the Taj Mahal, very, very short class. And so I've learned that it's the reason why it's so striking is that it's a very symmetrical building. And we know that the human eye perceives symmetry as very beautiful. They say human faces that are symmetrical. Obviously, they cannot be fully symmetrical. It just looks weird. It looks like AI took two parts of the face and kind of splashed them together. But those would be the faces considered beautiful. So naturally, a building that's deliberately done symmetrically, the gardens, right, the rest of the architecture is going to be considered beautiful. It's also also built of white marble. I mean, that's obviously very expensive way to construct a building, but the way that it interacts with sunlight changes depending on the time of day that it is. So for instance, like in the morning, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, it could be like a really beautiful light pinkish hue. And then it's just stark white in the middle of the day. And then closer to sunset, golden hour, it has this beautiful golden hue. But from what I understand, in the last few decades, because of the air pollution, the building started losing this brilliant white color. And I think the Indian government has been really intervening because it's not just an Indian landmark, it's like a World Heritage Site. They sort of try to cut down pollution to the point of like closing factories around it and not letting people park there. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I read. And it's supposedly helped a little bit. But anyway, back when this young man was traveling, he didn't really have to deal with anything of that nature. And the building was beautiful white marble that would change color throughout the day. So it's definitely very striking. So from India, he headed to Sri Lanka, he headed to Singapore, and I was kind of thinking about Singapore. Again, I've never been there, but from what I understand, it's a place that's always humid, but it's the least humid around this time. Although from what I understand, its rain season is also kind of, maybe not the rain season, but it's more rainy at this time. But in terms of people not being able to handle like insane humidity, again, this probably would have been a good time to travel. From there, this young man, Cousin George, and everyone else he's traveling with, they go to Java, right? To the island in Indonesia that's super famous. Obviously, the landscapes are absolutely insane. Just again, going from a beautiful place to beautiful place is probably overwhelmed by all the sights and sounds, even as someone who's privileged. And from there, he goes to Thailand. And in Thailand, he spends maybe like about a week, and he's wined and dined by the leader of that country. Marcel, have you ever been wined and dined by a leader of a country? I haven't, not yet. That would be pretty fun, huh?
For sure.
I'm sure the level of reception of Thailand was pretty impressive. And again, all the wildlife, all the landmarks, beautiful nature, which is very much unlike, where he normally lives, was very, very striking to him. From there, can you guess where he would go from Thailand?
Well, I would go up China and then...
Yes. Ooh, look at you. Look at you go. It's working. You can actually, not everyone can see a map in their mind, even people who know geography. But yes, that is exactly what he did. He went to China, and he specifically stopped in Wuhan, which I feel like in today's day and age had a little bit of a bad publicity connected to...
We cannot say that in YouTube.
Yeah, things that we cannot mention on YouTube. An illness that cannot be named. But of course, it's, a city with, a long history. It's a very large city. And at that time, he was really interested in touring different parts of the city and sort of surrounding areas. He went to see just these vast tea plantations, which, is very, very exotic. I've never been to a tea plantation, and I'm a huge tea drinker, maybe on par with being a coffee drinker. And so finally...
I thought they came from supermarket bags, so...
You know what? It's really funny because it's like when people ask you if you would drink, I don't want to name the brand, but it's kind of a famous brand that starts with an E, EG. And I can't... I don't interpret it as tea. It's like water. It's like how some Europeans call, I remember meeting this many years ago, this girl from Finland kept calling American and Canadian beer reindeer piss, pardon my French. And so I think this is how Europeans interpret North American beer, maybe like big brands, maybe not from small breweries. I feel like tea is kind of like that in the sense where these big brands and tea bags, they're so just diluted and just tasteless. There are exceptions to this, of course, but it doesn't compare to drinking actual either leaves or, matcha, which would be a powder, right, in Japan. So yeah, I feel like if you've or if you actually drink real coffee, you can't go to certain chains that are sort of, I don't want to again mention the names, but I'm thinking of one in Canada, TH. It doesn't taste like coffee and it does nothing for you. So I kind of feel like that, right? So
Coffee.
I don't know if I'm a
North
tea
America is not
connoisseur,
a
but
good
I
idea.
definitely. Yeah. So this young man was definitely interested in tea plantations and tea consumption. Yeah, so you're right. So he's in Wuhan, and he's really impressed by the vastness of the tea plantations. And of course, China is really amazing. And finally, he sets off for Japan, which is part of our heading here. So you could have probably predicted this particular feature of the story. He goes to Japan. Can you kind of picture the map in your mind without Googling? Where would you go if you're going from Wuhan, China to Japan? Would you go to the south? Would you go
south.
to the north? Yeah.
I would go to the deep south, which is probably the closest part to China.
Exactly. So it's
Japan
kind of
is
like...
kind of like this.
Yeah. And so I don't know exactly. I'm not a marine navigator. I don't know how they have to kind of... Because on a map, it looks like it's a straight shot. So perhaps they had to kind of take something that looked a little more curved based on various factors, currents, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, basically that was sort of the closest point. So this young man goes to the final point of his foreign, insanely long and amazing vacation. Now it's April, right? So he departed in October. We're now in April. So imagine how much time he spent in each place and just how much information he absorbed, how much yummy food that you and I are not eating today he's consumed, how much shopping he did, how many landmarks he saw. Yeah, it's just like a sensory overload, I would say. Like to me, it's almost like if I had the money, this would be too much. I would maybe focus on 3 things here and I'll be like, all right, next time. This is on my bucket list, but I'll do it later. Yeah, and so yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you could handle it, Marcelo. You did a 10-hour marathon live streaming. Maybe you could handle 12. 12, even better. Congratulations. Maybe you could do.
Was there?
I know. Maybe you could do a 6-month or almost 7-month long trip with just the sensory overload. So yeah, you're exactly right. He goes to the southernmost tip of southwestern Japan, right? So he goes to the Kyushu island and he lands in Kagoshima. And from there, he starts heading sort of a little bit north and then a little bit east and a little bit east. So the first place that he goes to is Nagasaki. And of course, Nagasaki since 1945 is only known to the general public. That's the first thing they think of as the atomic strikes by Americans on Japan, right? Hiroshima, Nagasaki, that's how it comes up. Obviously, once again, it's a city with a lot of history. This was sort of one of the places where foreigners would travel prior to the time that we're talking about as well. So obviously, we shouldn't reduce the history of Nagasaki to this one very, very unfortunate, tragic, and avoidable, most important event. And so in Nagasaki, he does the thing that lots of young men do. Marcelo, can you guess what things 22-year-old slightly partying men would do?
He got fucked up. It's not,
You're like, did he go out to meet some women? Did he go out drinking?
Yeah,
what do you think he did?
Sake and
What is another thing that young men, maybe in foreign countries, would do when they're being a little bit rebellious?
Oh, for sure, getting in a fight.
But what is something else that you would do? Maybe not you, but other people.
Well, for sure, when I was 22, the things that I would look for was fun, party, and whatever.
Would you be partying and go out and get a tattoo in some random place? I wouldn't. I don't have any tattoos, but of course, we know lots of people in our lives who would be partying, especially if they're on vacation, and it's kind of fun to go and hopefully get a tattoo that shouldn't be removed afterwards. But this is what he did. He went out with cousin George, his party friend, and he got in Nagasaki, specifically in Japan. So he was being this typical 22-year-old. And of course, Japan is known for beautiful, beautiful, detailed, very particular style of art. Now, in sort of common parlance, I think prior to the recent few decades, it was primarily associated with the Yakuza, right? The mafia. I think in people's minds, this is what they think of. They think of people having full body tattoos, full sleeves, etc., but very beautiful art, right? And you can kind of probably picture, do you know the subjects of Japanese tattoos in traditional culture?
No.
Well, I'm sure like the fish, like you probably see in the koi fish,
I've
right?
seen, of course, the fish, what we call carpa in Portuguese.
Yes, carpia,
You know, carpia, okay. The
koi fish,
usually
yeah.
You got the Fuji.
In Russian, we call them carp too.
Carp too.
No, carp, comma, two.
Carp, okay.
Yeah.
So the Fuji mountain, things like that. That's
so
the
natural
what-
things, and of course mythological things like dragons, right? So
and-
that's sort
and-
of
and
another thing.
writings. Yeah, dragons.
Yeah, so that's kind of another thing and sometimes people who really don't know much, they start confusing Chinese dragons with Japanese dragons, right? So, but you know, Japanese dragons have a very particular style. So our 22-year-old party boy went out and got a large tattoo on his forearm featuring a Japanese dragon using very, very skilled professionals from Nagasaki. It took several hours. You can kind of imagine how much time a detailed tattoo on a forearm that's fully colored, you know, using kind of traditional colors like the yellow horns, the green paws, the red belly, kind of like the traditional colors too, how long that would take. So he was a little bit rebellious, right, for a 22-year-old. Cousin George also decided to get a tattoo as well. So there's sort of a pair of these privileged party boys. And I've never been to Nagasaki. I've never been to Kagoshima, but I have been to that particular island. And so I've been to Kumamoto and I've been to Fukuoka. Kumamoto is sort of like dead center, maybe a little bit north. And then Fukuoka was like way north, almost facing Korea. And my initial trip, the very first trip to Japan where I didn't know anything about the language, one of the places I visited was Kumamoto, and of course it blew me away. It was not also a hot season yet. It was late spring, so it was much more manageable. It looked to me very tropical, you know, palm trees, et cetera, you know, kind of a very traditional old Kumamoto castle. And I sort of have these really, you know, when you have a really good trip, it kind of sticks in your mind. So this is one of the places that I have in my mind. I haven't been there since because it's kind of far to travel. If you flying into Tokyo, you have to sort of trek all across the country from the east to the west. And then, of course, Fukuoka was very interesting, too. It was much more north. I went there in late winter, so it was colder, much, much colder, and beautiful seaside park. And I did what I usually do, which is stalk wildlife and take pictures of predatory birds. Specifically, Japan is known for its kites. It's spelled much like the kite that you would fly in a park, but it's a bird. And so I've now have like a collection of these kite photographs from all over Japan, from the east, from the west. So that's kind of my, this is kind of my thing. I'm a little bit nerdy, but yeah, it's definitely fun. So that's kind of my experience with Kyushu. It's definitely worth visiting. I think most people who are sort of doing the one trip to Japan, they don't go as far because it's sort of like, well, I would say Westerners, obviously Koreans, this is like the closest point for them to come. But yeah, if you're flying from Europe or North America, they usually do, you know, the typical like Tokyo, Kyoto, etc. So they don't go as far, but it's definitely recommended. So you can kind of understand why our 22-year-old rebel with newly implemented dragon tattoo, which he did say was very painful. for someone who's never had a tattoo, he said it was very painful. You know, I think it was more than 7 hours that it took for them to actually implemented and fully completed. So from there, he ends up heading even more east, sort of northeast. So he goes to Kobe, and finally he ends up in Kyoto. And you know, Kyoto is probably, if it's not the second most visited, it's the most visited place, right? It's one of the old capitals of the country. It has intensely long history. This year, the Japanese government has been cracking down on tourists. Specifically, they banned tourists from certain areas because they were just, I would say, Western tourists, out of control. So for instance, you would have these Maiko girls who are dressed very traditionally. So they're sort of like mini geishas, to put it very roughly. Tourists would literally come and touch them, like Or they would go to areas that look very traditional, but they're residential. They're not like temples and museums. Like people live there, and they would just go and snap pictures. So I can kind of understand the Japanese government why they would be like, okay, guys, enough.
Get
Like,
lost.
so you can kind of see why Westerners can be perceived as barbarians by East Asians when you see that type of behavior. Yeah, so it's a little bit out of control, but definitely Kyoto is known for very old traditional, just Kyoto, and I guess I would say the surrounding area, like Nara, for instance, very old temples that are more than 1,000 years old. So for instance, like the Toji Temple, and the famous deer park that's sort of in Nara that everyone loves to go and feed deer and takes pictures, like that's there these days. The Philosopher's Walk in Kyoto. So it's just like that city is just, for people who kind of envision Japan, it has all the traditional architecture, which kind of explains why people go there, to the point where it's overflowing with tourists. And I was actually supposed to meet my Japanese teacher, and she also works as an English-speaking tour guide. She got multiple tours added onto what she had, so she was unable to meet me. That's how insane Kyoto was this summer. So you can kind of see how the city has maintained its attraction for centuries. Obviously, these days it's foreigners from all over the world. And so Kyoto is also in a prefecture that's next to Kyoto is another city. It's kind of even today, I think it's maybe like less than 500,000 people. So, I guess it depends where you live. For some people, that would be really small. For other people, that would be still kind of big. I don't know. What about you, Marcelo?
Yeah, for a Brazilian, 500,000 people, 500,000 people, it's small trying to get medium city.
Yeah, and so of
for
course,
an Italian perspective,
time,
it's a huge city. For an Italian perspective, it's a huge.
Yeah, I guess if you compare it to smaller
general
cities, yeah. So these days, it's pretty big. It's actually the capital. How Japan is divided into prefectures, and so it's actually the capital, I believe, of the Shiga prefecture. I really hope I'm not mispronouncing that, even though I should know my Japanese. And the city is called Otsu. So the reason our young, rebellious, newly tattooed friend and cousin George, his permanent partner in crime, cousin George, went to Otsu when it was much smaller, is because it's really close to Japan's largest, I think it's the largest freshwater lake, called Lake Biwa, and it's a very beautiful lake. So these days, people do the same kinds of things that you would do in a large lake. You can go on a bike ride around it. You can go hiking. I have a particular rock star that I follow because I'm kind of plugged into the Japanese music scene. He loves to go fishing there. So when I'm looking at his Instagram, when he's not touring and pleasing the crowds with his quasi-metal screams, he is fishing. He's fishing on Lake Biwa, and apparently it's a popular pastime for people. Obviously, I'm assuming you can go swimming somewhere there. But yeah, it's very similar to, I've actually always wanted to go, and I keep missing going to that particular lake. But anyway, this is what our young, privileged, newly tattooed friend and cousin George were doing. They were only on a day trip. Now today, to go from Kyoto Station, I believe, to Otsu probably takes like less than 15 minutes, like super quick on a train. At the time when he was traveling, it took longer because this, happened a while back. And it was still, though, enough to be able to go there and come back within the same day to go on a day trip to check out the beautiful nature. And so, imagine you're out. It's, I guess it's like early May. So Japan in early May, sort of sakura just bloomed. It's still very beautiful. It's very much manageable in terms of the temperature. It's probably, I would say, like fall, maybe October, November, and April, May, weather-wise, is probably the nicest time to go to Japan. And so, of course, they're enjoying the sights and sounds. And finally, it's time to go back to Kyoto, where they're staying. And all of a sudden, one of the policemen accompanying this group of people, so this young man, Cousin George, and everyone else traveling with them, gets out a weapon. He gets out a saber and starts striking our friend, our newly tattooed friend, in the face.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, they're like out of the blue. And this is where Cousin George became very, very useful because he saved our friend's life. He actually had a cane, a walking cane for, I guess, their little hiking trip. He ended up stopping the blows, preventing further blows of this very sharp sword, essentially, by using the cane. And at this point, the Japanese policeman, obviously, when he was stopped, his name was Sanzo Tsuda. He just takes off, right? Like, he failed. He did not manage to strike our friend in the face sufficiently to kill him. He's been, Cousin George came to the rescue. Thank you, Cousin George. the tattooed cousins, right? And at this stage, the rickshaw drivers that were obviously taking them around, they ended up chasing after policeman Tsuda, and they ended up catching him. So he's now tackled. And our friend ended up with a 9-centimeter long scar on his face. So that's about 4 inches or so. So it's actually pretty big if you think about a facial injury. Obviously, all the important parts of the face were luckily avoided. He ended up being treated. He was taken to Kyoto. He was actually taken to the palace that was there. He was treated. He didn't really suffer. This didn't end up being sort of obviously a life-threatening injury, but he did end up suffering headaches for the rest of his life from this injury. Yeah, so I mean, it was a pretty serious situation. I think if Cousin George did not interfere, our rebellious 22-year-old Tsar Nicholas II, before he was a Tsar, he was a prince. He was an heir to the throne. He would ascend the throne 3 years later. I don't think he would have ended up ruling Russia, and history would have been possibly very, very different. So, Marcelo, could you tell that I'm talking about the future Tsar, the last Tsar of the Russian Empire?
Well, you just spoiled the rest of the story. I don't know why you did it. No, I mean, I had no idea. I saw the thumbnail that you made, and I was like, all right, there's some royalty on that, and some dude. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to Google this. Last time I did this, kind of spoiled the rest of the story for me, and it's funnier to get surprised at some point at story. And I had no idea, but yeah, I could tell it was some royalty, but I thought it was more related to Japan. While you were talking about, I was like, is this some British royalty? Because he came all the way from Greece.
Cousin George was actually Greek/Danish royalty. So thank you, Cousin George. Thank you, Cousin George, for saving, or maybe not thank you, because as much as I mentioned this many times, as much as I empathize with the fate of Nicholas II as a person, especially his family, I would say his family, especially his children, no questions asked. He was a very weak ruler. I think he was very sort of head in the clouds, idealistic, just who knows.
It was the sword injured, you see?
Yeah, it was the injury.
His head, he got.
This was before CAT scans. We don't know if he had some kind of brain damage, right?
Yeah, had headaches.
He did. Yes, exactly. I mean, it was a serious enough injury to get headaches. So, but possibly there was some other injury that we're not aware of, because this was 1891, right? So this is before the age of CAT scans. We don't really know how far the injury went.
The bomb.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think you can now tell why this young man was so privileged, but there are a few things that are very interesting about this particular situation, is sort of in the immediate aftermath, but also in the geopolitical context. So the this policeman who attacked and unsuccessfully, did not kill Nicholas. And he was caught by these rickshaw drivers that were actually then very much complimented and awarded by, the Russian government. They were taken on the ship, et cetera, for acting quickly and helping apprehend the criminal. But to this day, they don't really know what the reason for that was, because when you first kind of hear about it, you think it must be a politically motivated attempt. But if you actually start looking into it, there are all kinds of theories. Now, of course, political motivation is one of them, but they talk about he was deranged, which I think is kind of an easy explanation. They talk about his hatred of foreigners, which, I mean, possibly. Japan had opened to, remember, Japan was pretty much a closed country up until the 1850s when American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with ships, gunboats, and engaged in a little bit of gunboat diplomacy, making Japan an offer it could not refuse, else the gunboats. And so Japan had to sign the Convention of Kagoshima, opening itself up. So then, of course, it had more contact with the United States, right, with Europe, with Russia, but of course it's like next to Russia, right? So there's a little bit of a different context there. And Japan was industrializing, the Meiji Restoration started. So, because remember, Japan was essentially a society that was, it had an emperor, but sort of an emperor in the name only, right? So it was run by the military government, essentially, right? And so the imperial restoration started in the latter part of the 19th century, where there was not just an emperor who just happened to be an aristocrat. It was an emperor who actually had political power. So this is sort of the general context here. And in fact, when the emperor realized that the heir to the Russian throne, the only heir to a throne to visit Japan in the recent past, was attacked and almost killed, he hopped on a train and he at night and he personally came to visit Nicholas, the future Nicholas II. This was Emperor Meiji, and the emperor, Nicholas was himself accompanied by a Japanese prince, right? He was accompanied by Prince Arisugawa. I don't want to mispronounce it. So he was accompanied by members of, highly positioned royal family. But the fact that the emperor was like, holy shit, this is not good. And, just thinking about the Japanese hospitality, generosity, propriety, when there is an assassination attempt made, you obviously want to sort of make things as go well as possible. This made me think of the Slovakian assassination attempt on Fico, because it's I don't want to make like too many parallels here, but I think we can make some parallels, because I haven't seen any recent articles, but the idea of, is it derangement or is it a politically motivated attack has been floated about too. Of course, me with my tinfoil hat, I think other things can be used as an explanation, but on the surface, the explanation is very, very similar. It's like a lone attacker. The lack of protection provided in each of the cases, here for the leader of Slovakia, here for a foreign guest traveling with a prince from Greece and Denmark and a local Japanese prince. And of course, he's the heir to the throne, not having sufficient protection. It was very embarrassing to the Japanese government, of course. So that I thought was an interesting parallel too. Obviously, the survival of both assassination attempts as well, I thought was a kind of an interesting parallel. But the other parallel, of course, is international relations, right? So Fico has been kind of this black sheep in the EU, trying to mend relations with Russia, kind of speaking out against the Ukrainian war. In the case of Russia and Japan, now obviously the circumstances in late 1800s were different, but basically Japan was industrializing and slowly beginning to expand. It'll go into Korea very shortly. By 1905, it'll be like, hello, Korea, you're ours. Russia, of course, also was very prominent in the Far East as well. And in 1891, unlike 1904, 1905, when Russia lost a war to Japan, Japan did not feel strong enough to have a military confrontation. So at that point, Japan, of course, preferred diplomacy. So that's a huge fuck up for diplomacy when you have, again, the first heir to a throne that's about to ascend. You know, he ascended in 1894, so they knew it was coming, you know, soon. That's not a good way to to mend relations and improve diplomacy by having your citizen, you know, try to assassinate essentially this leader because you didn't provide enough protection, because there was some kind of an oversight, because this man was deranged, maybe he was acting for political reasons. So yeah, it was hugely embarrassing for them. But yeah, it's really interesting to look at it from that international relations perspective, where just 14 years later, Japan kicked our butts, right? It was industrialized enough, and Russia had its own problems. You can sort of talk about Nicholas as a Tsar, even engaging in this type of warfare. All kinds of issues were relevant. We talked about this when we did our episode, you know, the death of the Russian samurai, because it was in the context of the Russo-Japanese War.
I was about to say that.
I know. It's like, all I do is Russia and Japan. It's like, next time we'll do Austria.
Yeah, you guys are not paying attention to the channels. We had that. You got me when you start saying about the dragon tattoo, because we already said that in the channel before.
Yes.
You guys are not paying attention. You guys on the chat.
Pay attention. There are clues in the channel.
They're Easter eggs.
Easter eggs, yes, exactly. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting how quickly Japan ended up industrializing and actually felt strong enough to have a confrontation with Russia, which was considered not just a major sort of European empire, but also a major military that has had multiple victories. It had won, you know, the Russo-Turkish War, for instance, of 1877, 1878. So it kind of had that reputation as well. So to kind of crush not just an army that's perceived as European by the Japanese, but also an army that has this reputation, I mean, that was very impressive, not so impressive for Russia, right? And yeah, it's kind of interesting how quickly things developed. But at this stage, Japan was choosing the peaceful path, right? The path of diplomacy. So for Nicholas, this wasn't just a fun vacation. Obviously, it had that component. It wasn't just education, but there was that diplomatic component. And actually, another focal point, which happened after this attack, he ended up going to Vladivostok, Russia, because that was sort of the official opening the Trans-Siberian Railway. That went all the way across the country. I mean, that was a major feat, because you consider how huge the Russian Empire was. It was sort of a little bit late, as you know, in terms of industrializing. It was Stalin who really launched that process. But cities were industrialized, and of course the railway was built. Again, they were smaller railways throughout Russia, in sort of the European part of Russia. So this was like a huge feat. And that was the purpose. One of the ultimate focal points for Nicholas to go is to observe the launch and sort of the celebration of the railway in Vladivostok, where he did go. He did cut his trip short, although the Russian government accepted all the necessary apologies by the Japanese government. So on the surface, there were no hostilities. They thought they did enough to capture the criminal. Eventually, they sentenced him to death, and then they commuted his sentence to life. But he actually ended up dying of an illness. So he never really served much time in prison for this assassination attempt. He just ended up dying. But because of this issue of embarrassment, just some insane thing, I think, again, for us who are not Japanese, the things that some people did were insane. Well, some of them did really nice things. They sent lots of letters and telegrams to the Tsar, apologizing, thousands, right? So that's understandable. But the government in the city from which this would-be assassin was from, they banned the usage of his first name and his last name. No more. So, I mean, I guess in European culture back in the day, there was a sort of like maybe a curse on a name for doing something awful where you no longer want to use the name. So perhaps it is comparable in some ways in kind of a more traditional thinking. The other thing that was going to happen but did not happen, the city of Otsu was going to change its name because it's too embarrassing to be mentioned in the news of the time as this is the place where we almost, slaughtered with a saber to the face the would-be heir to, the Russian throne. Ultimately, they did not end up changing the name. I'm glad they kept the name. It's actually kind of an interesting part of history now. It's, as I said, now it's sort of like a city of just less than 500,000 people. It's still very close to the lake, so it's a really nice place to go to. I've never been, but like I said, I do want to go to that lake. And so it's definitely on my list, maybe for my 8th trip to Japan. Yes, I know it kind of sounds terrifying. 7 trips to Japan. But so that's another thing. And another crazy thing that happened is that one woman who read the news and realized, just like a random woman, realized that Nicholas would be the second was cutting his trip short, even though the Japanese government did all these gestures. The emperor himself came to sort of try to damage control. She ended up, I don't want to use the language, she ended up her throat in front of the kind of Kyoto government buildings. And of course, when she died, everyone praised her for being very patriotic. I think for us in today's day and age, it's kind of hard to understand because this wasn't like, it's like a very weird protest over that type of issue. Like it's not a war protest. Like it's, I don't know, it's kind of extreme. And it wasn't like, oh, we lost the battle, so we're gonna, that's more understandable for Japanese culture. This particular thing, when I read it, I was like, oh, she's just some random woman just decided to very harshly take herself out as an apology. Random. Perhaps she was not random. I mean, she is mentioned as like, she's not like nobility, but I guess she was dissatisfied with the extent of maybe apology seeking that her government engaged in, which again, to me strikes me as pretty insane. So that was another, I mean, I think there are all these little interesting parts of Japanese culture that you see that are sort of coming out of this incident as well. And I think just a kind of a fun pop cultural thing is the issue of tattoos, because now, I think today, they're probably, at least in North America, Canada, I don't know about Europe, more people seem to have at least a tattoo or be very covered in tattoos than not to have. At least like when I go to the gym, I'm probably the only person between the ages of 18 and like 85, because there's I see tattoos on much like grandmas, right? And so I think it's interesting because remember, tattoos went from being a few decades ago, at least in Russia, was kind of only associated either with sailors or the prison system. I think in North America, too, people thought of tattoos as being... South America
as well. Yeah,
only prison. I mean, these days in Korea, from what I understand, South Korea, tattoos are illegal. So you kind of have to go into like an underground parlor to get one. They're not illegal in Japan, but definitely surprising. So if you see like one of my favorite rock stars who goes fishing at Lake Biwa, he's covered in tattoos from head to toe. In North America, this would be, he's just another tattooed guy with like neck tattoos on his arms. In Japan, it's like, I'm sure they think like, holy shit, he's such a rebel. Yakuza. I know. I don't know if they think he's a Yakuza, but I think it's like he's a rebel because really not as many people have them. So it's still sort of like being accepted. But the thing that you get from people who have more conservative traditional thinking in North America, maybe in Europe, is that tattoos are very sort of low class. And I think I have 0 tattoos, but I think when you read about Nicholas and cousin George, Prince of Greece and Denmark, getting tattoos, it kind of disproves the idea that tattoos are low class. You have these you have other examples too of essentially not just aristocrats, but royalty getting tattoos because it's cool 100 and something years ago, right? So I kind of feel like personally, again, I have 0 tattoos, but I feel like if you're going to judge people, that's kind of like one of the dumber things to judge them on. Like, oh, they're so low class because they have sleeves. I feel like there are other things that you can judge them on for people who are sort of conservative minded. I know it sounds very basic, but you still hear it a lot.
Yeah.
And I am kind of a socially conservative person. And so that's why I'm sort of in this world a little bit. And to me, it's just like, of all the things, right? Like, this is just so stupid. Look at Nicholas II. He's got his dragon tattoo on his forearm, and it was very colorful. Yeah, and look at Prince George of Greece and Denmark. He too had tattoos. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's kind of a funny also debunking of tattoos are only low class, or tattoos are only, you know, well, back in the day it would have been only sailors and prisoners who had them. Yeah, so I think that's kind of an interesting side note here. But yeah, I think in terms of where geopolitical relations could have gone if Russia were dissatisfied at this time, I don't know if people go to war over assassination attempts that are done by a random person, but I could see that happening because people have gone to war over stupid reasons many, many times. And that war would have turned out differently, right, from the 1905 war. So Japan, I guess, ultimately did damage control in a successful way where it could go and kick our ass 14 years later. So it succeeded. It succeeded in this regard. So yeah. Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions? I see comments on the live stream, but I'm not sure if any of them are questions.
While you were talking, you basically answered most of the questions
most
that
of
I
them.
would
Okay,
have,
good.
which was basically, so that's why Russia went to war against Japan, right? And then, yeah, I got the point there. And of course, you answer who the person is, and I even remember that the episode that we had before. So who cares actually wrote that.
Hi, who cares? It sounds so weird. It's like I would just say like hi WC, because who cares sounds like hi who cares. If people who are listening,
I like saying that. I prefer calling who cares because, you know, I at some point I would just say who cares.
Who cares?
Nicholas II was the original hipster, he mentioned here.
I think he was. I mean, if you really think about it, he did. I mean, literally Google him. He took selfies. He took freaking selfies of himself. Yeah, there are pictures of him swimming freaking naked. He's actually in pretty good shape. I mean, I have to say, not a fan of Nicholas. He's very, very well built from the back. Yeah, I think he literally could be described as the original hipster. It's really kind of funny to think of it in this way. He would kind of dress up in a weird way. Remember, they did the 300th anniversary of the Romanov house, and they all dressed up in kind of like traditional Russian, more sort of not European influenced fashion, but Russian fashions with furs and stuff like that. So if you look at those photographs, I mean, they're beautiful. Definitely not the way the royalty would have been dressing at the time. But again, it's kind of like hipsters dressing up weird fashions, dragon tattoo, swimming butt naked, literally taking selfies. Yeah, he definitely is. he was more concerned about, maybe those things than actually
buying tea,
right? Buying tea in China. I mean, who knows if it was tea? He definitely went to a tea plantation, but we don't know what else he did there, right? This is like China in the opium wars period. Or post-opium wars. Yeah, so who knows? But yeah, he definitely seemed to have more, again, kind of non-political interest, which is completely fine for any other aristocrat or a civilian. But I mean, dude, you're a leader of a country. Like, it just kind of shows.
Put some clothes on.
Yeah, put some clothes on, right? Now the search for Nicholas II swimming naked is going to be one of those, butt naked, literally butt naked is going to be one. Nicholas II selfie. Yeah,
that's a good Twitter post.
Yeah,
we should do it.
We should do all the hipster things. Yeah, and credit who cares, all the hipster things that Nicholas II did. And of course, you know, there are all these Nicholas II fanatics in the West because he, you know, they specifically seem, the Bolsheviks killed them. And of course, you know, the Bolsheviks are bad. Therefore, we're only going to focus on this, even though there are like a ton of regime changes examples where Tsars and kings were removed by violent means. Their families were sometimes removed too. It's very awful, but it's not unusual to get rid of the leader and their family. So when people really focus on this, they get very emotional about Nicholas. And I feel like you need to put this into perspective and just say it's happened many times under different ideologies. It's very unfortunate, but it's not unusual for leaders to have that happen to them when they lose power. So yeah, I think people get very, very attached to Nicholas in this sense. So I think if I were to call him a hipster, I'll probably get a lot of hate, but maybe that's a good thing. It'll get lots of reposts. So
for sure. Yeah.
For sure.
Who cares also said that thankfully he couldn't release P. Anderson.
Right. There's lots of worse
Perhaps,
things that
we never know.
Nicholas,
Know.
If Nicholas were alive today, he'd be doing worse hipsterish things. I mean, he probably, he's got his little beard. He'd probably grow it out more. He'd probably wear like a man bun or something like that. Wear like a lumberjack shirt with his dragon tattoo, like sleeves rolled up. Yeah, I think I can totally see.
Yeah,
I'm sure there are photoshops of him floating around looking like that anyway. So we're probably not even saying anything new by making this funny comparison. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So everybody, guys, remember, so we have a small change in the channel, and this is QR codes. So for Brazilians, this is a QR code for the IDM channel where you can pix. North Americans and Europeans will not understand what a pix is, and Brazilians will, so you can pix here. And Nina has a Buy Me a Coffee over there somewhere, QR code. And remember,
Nina will eventually
Nina
introduce
coffee.
Memberships. Marcelo has memberships. I've yet to introduce them because I am a little bit busy these days, but we'll get there. So
I just had a 12-hour. I still have not recovered from that. Still have back pains and everything.
it was a masochistic punishment of your own doing. But I think it's a fun idea, and I think it went well, at least in my sleep-deprived state, drinking coffee between, 3:30 to 5:30 a.m., and then I couldn't fall asleep at all, even though I had worked the 14-hour shift prior to that. Yeah, I think it's a fun idea. I think it was the less formal factor to me was interesting. Yeah. I don't know what the viewers thought, but I think it's kind of a good, different thing to do occasionally.
At some point, it was hijacked by Brazilians, so the idea was to have everybody from around the world, and we even had.
We saw Carl Jha was in an accident, so we couldn't have him.
I was about to say that exactly. I wrote him. He didn't answer me. I said, "Oh shit! Okay, he forgot about it. He has something."
And then you realized, "Oh crap, poor guy."
And then at some point, his wife tweeted, "Well, Carl had been to an accident." And I said, "Oh shit, dude, are you all right?" I WhatsApped him, "Are you all right?" And then we chat a little bit, and he was fine. He was okay.
Yeah.
CIA tried to break his tweeting hand. They didn't manage.
Oh, there's probably more truth to that than we think there is, which is kind of scary to think about. Yeah, but anyway, this is all for me. We're now, as I've posted in my community tab, we're going to be doing Wednesdays because it works better for both of our schedules, unless of course there is a particular guest who wants to live stream because they don't necessarily have the capacity to do that. Sometimes we record, as you've noticed, who is available on a different day. And then, of course, we kind of follow their schedule if it works with our schedule. This is why it changes. But yeah, now we're going to be doing Wednesdays until further notice, or unless there is an individual guest that can only do it on a different day. So hopefully that works for everyone. But of course, people can tune in later. Oh, and by the way, I think someone asked, or a few people asked, why the live chat disappears. I think it's when I edit out that initial intro. YouTube doesn't repopulate it. I don't know why. I try to.
What?
So you know how when you don't edit the initial wait period for these lives, the live chat shows up after they're over. However, when I edit it out, it's gone and it says live chat replay is not available for this video.
There's I'll teach you later.
Is there a way to turn it back on? Because I couldn't find it.
So you have to allow it before.
But I do allow it before. That's the thing. I always allow it, but when I edit the video, it says it's no longer available when I edit that initial bit. But I always click on allowing it.
That's very weird. I have to check my own as well. I never checked that, and nobody ever complained.
But anyway, this is why a few people kept asking where it disappears. So it's not any kind of censorship. It's basically,
as far as
I always turn it on to have not just the chat, but the replay, because I think it's interesting for people to see and for me to see. And then whenever I edit that initial, 10, 15 minute period that we're setting up, it just disappears and it says it's no longer available. I couldn't find it anywhere later, but maybe there is some setting that would bring it back. But perhaps because I kind of thought it would be attached to the timestamps in the video. I don't know how it works technically. So
one thing that I know for sure is that if you, instead of putting youtube.com/live / the video hash, instead of putting live, you put watch. You watch the video, but it does not have the replay on it. The chat
maybe
replay on it.
Interesting. Okay, I'll see if that makes a difference. But anyway,
that's one thing that I know.
So, but anyway, I wanted to sort of address this question. It's not censorship. This has been my experience. Maybe I'm screwing something else up, but I've noticed that when I edit, because who wants to scroll through the initial 10, 15 minutes? No one. When YouTube allows me to do it, within 24 hours, I do it. And then it no longer shows the comments. So it is what it is, but we'll figure it out. All right. Thank you guys for watching.
Just everybody, before next week, I want to hear that Nina received a hell lot of cup of coffee. Okay. I want
no
to see
begging,
her
Marcelo.
her.
No begging.
I'm not begging. I'm telling you guys.
Marcelo is taking charge. No, I think we should be nice, Marcelo.
I'm nice. Help the work of the channels. We are here trying to do the best for you guys.
Anyway, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and we'll continue, hopefully, trying to intersperse interesting guests whom you seem to be enjoying with story time. And I'm still working on my other videos that are more traditional format. It's taking a little longer because I'm swamped, but they will be up. And hopefully you'll like a little bit of the different approach that I'm taking to them, basically. All right, thank you guys. I'll see you in the next one, and so will Marcelo.
See you guys. Bye-bye.